them light up. So the whole collection, all at once, will glow, as you see on the right here. And this actually has a biological function because these bacteria live in the gut of, I think it's a squid, and they have a kind of symbiotic relationship with the squid, so that when they light up, this helps the squid to camouflage itself in its environment so that it can hunt better. They get a protected region in which to live and thrive. But it's also interesting that bacteria in fact use this very same mechanism, which is it's called quorum sensing. That's a technical term. They use the same mechanism to invade cells in your body. So it's not the case that one bacterium comes along and invades one of your cells and then you get some kind of food poisoning. Bacteria are so small that they wouldn't stand a chance against your body. What they do is they mass at the doorway to your cells until they get millions and millions. They sense their growing strength. And when it crosses a threshold that they know is good enough to challenge your immune system, then they release so-called virulence factors and they invade the cell. So it's a very interesting collective behavior. Again, looking at one bacterium, you'd never know this. It only comes out in the collective. You find this interesting collective order. So I just started out with some really simple systems. Bacteria are very complicated, in fact, but externally at least, they look like little bags of chemicals that behave very similarly, very simply. Perhaps the best example is this little system of beads. It's almost impossible to think of something even simpler than that, and yet you get all this structure and order out of the system. The question is, can the same kinds of things happen to people and systems with people? Most of us, at least we usually live under the picture that we're self-determined, we're making our own decisions. We wake up in the morning and decide what to do. We determine what jobs we want to take, where we want to live, who we want our friends to be. And that's probably largely true. And yet, at the same time, could it be that like those beads in that shaking chamber, we're also affected by collective patterns that emerge around us and that constrain our lives and push us in directions that we might not otherwise choose. If you imagine a particular bead in that experiment trying to explain why everything suddenly went haywire and these magical patterns emerged, that bead would probably say, I have no idea. I didn't do anything to make this happen. It wasn't my fault. And yet, once the pattern emerges, that bead's behavior is changed just like everything else in the system. So I'd like to start with a few simple examples of systems involving people where we know this is true, and then move on to some more complicated systems, including markets, where there's good evidence it's true, and I think we're finally getting some tools and the ability and mindset that helps us to try to understand these collective patterns that are in fact very important in human social systems. So, as I said, I'm going to start with the very simple and move to the more complicated. We have a glass of water. So this is a situation we've all been in. So you're moving down the motorway, you're in a hurry, you really need to get somewhere in another hour or half an hour, and traffic's moving along fine, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, just in front of you, it stops. So you come to a halt, or maybe not a halt, but you slowly move along for another 15 minutes. The irritating thing is that you never see a car that's broken down. You never see some police car by the edge of the road that stops somebody. There's no specific identifiable cause that you can say actually made this traffic jam happen. And then suddenly you come to the end of it and you spurt out the other side and you take off again, and it is totally mysterious. Where did that thing come from? Why was it there? No one seemed to cause it. Or was there someone who caused it and then took off before you got there? Who knows? Well, in fact, this is now well understood. It's well understood in traffic engineering that these are called phantom traffic jams. And so phantom refers to the fact that they have no apparent cause, but in fact they do have a very real and understandable cause, and it's very simple. When the traffic density is sufficiently low, then it's easy for, if someone slows down ways in front of you, you don't maybe even need to slow down because there's sufficient room that by the time they've slowed down and sped up again, you don't have to slow down yourself. There's no interaction really between the cars. As the density gets higher, this interaction becomes more important. At some point, and you can show this in computer simulations very simply and also in experiments, the density gets so high that when one person puts on their brake, even just by accident, this will cause the second person to put on their brake even more, which causes the third person to put it on even more. At some point, someone comes to a stop, and then the person behind them stops. And what you actually find is that these pulse-like traffic jams will move back upstream the roadway at a well-defined velocity, something like 8 kilometers per hour. That depends on the speed of the roadway, the size of the cars, and so forth. But it's a purely physical phenomenon, just like a backup of a flow in a tube where suddenly the liquid can't flow through a little hole as quickly as it was. So people here have, of course, some freedom. You have lots of freedom to listen to the radio as loud as you like and sing to it if you want. But in terms of your behavior on the roadway, your freedom is really highly constrained. You can change lanes, you can speed up and slow down within limits, but other than that, you really are kind of constrained into the system as it's set up around you. And this very simple human behavior, in this particular case, leads to these interesting phantom traffic jams that emerge out of kind of nowhere and yet really affect your life. So you end up being late to that meeting that was very important through no fault of your own. Now here's a slightly more interesting example that may be more surprising. So this is the London Millennium Bridge. And it was the first pedestrian bridge built over the Thames in London in several hundred years. And it was opened in June in the year 2000. Early in the morning, they opened it up, people started streaming onto the bridge, and by the afternoon, they shut it down because a policeman had noticed that the bridge was wobbling. It was swinging about 10 centimeters back and forth in either direction. So this is, of course, great embarrassment to the politicians for whom this was a landmark project. Engineers went to work trying to figure out what was going on here, and in fact, they really couldn't figure it out. So there's a famous case called the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. And probably everyone's seen the film, this huge bridge somewhere in the western United States. It was actually caught by a process called vortex shedding, where wind blowing by the bridge would set up big vortices, which would eventually come free and tear off, and the bridge would swing back. And there was a resonance between this process and the bridge swinging. Eventually, the whole thing fell apart. Now, in this case, there is no apparent cause of that sort. So there's no wind, there's no structural damage. What was causing the problem? So the mathematicians eventually figured out. It took about 6 months to figure out what was going on here. And let me tell you the story of what they found. So early in the morning, a few people started walking onto the bridge. Now, what happens when you walk onto a bridge? You're walking back and forth, stepping a little bit left and right. And each time you step, you do actually give a little kick to the bridge, right or left. So small it doesn't matter. And when you get 50 people on the bridge, each person's giving a small kick to the bridge, left or right. Still, doesn't matter. Also, everyone is walking randomly. They're not synchronized with each other. So the kicks are coming all different moments. Nothing is kind of in an orderly fashion. When about 150 people get on the bridge, there's an increased chance that just randomly, at the same moment, maybe 6 people will step down at the same moment. This is just enough to give the bridge enough kick that it passes the threshold of human detection. So you actually feel the bridge move a tiny little bit. And what do you do when you feel the ground beneath you move? You respond to catch your balance. What that does is 2 things. The first one is it gives the bridge a little more kick, but the much more important thing is that it synchronizes you with 6 or 10 other people who would cause the initial kick. And when the 10 of you now kick in the other direction, that does the same thing even bigger, so that synchronizes more people. And pretty quickly you have 150 people moving in unison, pushing the bridge left and right. So the interesting thing is that it was the people, it was this social pattern, again, in a really simple setting of social behavior, that organized itself and drove the bridge into this unstable condition. Very, very interesting and non-intuitive outcome. People just responding to the world around them and in a kind of automatic, almost automatic way, and leading to an interesting pattern. Since then, engineers have put big damping devices on the edge of the bridge, so it just won't happen anymore. One final example of a fairly simple kind of self-organization phenomenon in social systems, but one that's very important, and this is racial segregation. So in the United States, racial segregation, or the persistence of racial segregation, is a puzzle. The puzzle is that back in the 1940s, attitudes about racial segregation were, the general public attitude